If I play the par 3s in even par over the 4 days, I know I'm going to have a good week.
There are two types of golfers, those who suck at par 3s and those who really suck at par 3s. Even PGA Tour players play par 3s over par on average. But worry not, in this video we're going to learn how to dominate. I'm just kidding, we're not going to dominate par 3s. They're not meant to be dominated, but we can learn how to suck less at them, which makes a huge impact to the handicap. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's do it. Hey, welcome to the channel. I'm Manu. We're going to tackle these par 3s in 3 parts. See what I did there? First, we're going to talk about some mind-blowing stats that will also make us all feel better about ourselves. Second, we'll talk a little bit about course architecture and what makes these par 3s so hard, which will be very handy in analyzing them when you're on the course next time. And finally, we'll come up with a foolproof plan to play these par 3s in the future, which is guaranteed to lower your handicap. As my Australian friends would say, too easy, mate. Let's go. So before we get into the data, here's what got me thinking about par 3s in the first place. Besides the fact that, like everybody else, I suck at par 3s too, or I used to suck. Now I suck less. But I have a buddy who used to be a tour player and is now a coach. And he met with Brooks Koepka once, who told him,
if I play the par 3s in even par over the 4 days, I know I'm going to have a good week.
What an incredible coincidence. I swear that's 100% true, that story. But what an incredible coincidence that the one pseudo-personal story I have about par 3s is about Brooks Koepka, who just managed to do really well at the Masters last week. So thank you, universe. That's very helpful. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about Brooks at the Masters. So here are his scores. And what you see is the days that he played well, he actually played pretty well, or, even par on the par 3s. And the days he didn't play so well, not so good on the par 3s. Now, you could talk about correlation, causation. Some days you're striking the ball better and other days you're not. So which one really applies? I don't know. But what we do know is Brooks' story matches up with the results we just saw from the Masters. And if you look at Jon Rahm's scores, pretty much the same thing. The days he played well, pretty good on the par 3s. Net, what it comes down to is if you play the par 3s well, you're probably going to have a good week. So that's the backstory. Now let's move on to part 1, looking at the data. All right, so let's start with the data to get a clear idea of what we're working with. So first, PGA Tour data. This year, Jon Rahm, surprise, surprise, is leading the par 3 scoring average with 2.84 strokes per hole. That is absurdly good. How good? Well, out of the 203 players listed on this, only 34 of them, that's 15% of them, play par 3s in even par or better. That means 85% of pros this year are playing par 3s in over par on average. Do you feel better yet? But you might say, Manu, I'm a lowly amateur. What are the numbers for lowly amateur players? Fair enough. Let's look at some amateur numbers. So these are from the Arccos dataset, which I got via my Golf Spy. The full article is linked below if you want to read it. So if you look at this graph, what you see is for 125 to 150 yards, so the distance is up top. On average, PGA Tour pros average 2.99 strokes a hole, so almost par. And when you start looking at different handicaps, the numbers go up. So for a regular amateur at 1 to 5 handicap, they're averaging close to 3.5 strokes a hole. And then that goes up to, a 15 plus handicap averages 4.14 strokes a hole, which makes sense. You'd expect like a 15 plus handicap to play basically bogey golf. So roughly 1.14 strokes more. Math adds up. And as the holes get longer, you start seeing that these numbers change. So at 150 yards, you're still looking at a PGA Tour average of just under par of 2.99. But for the amateurs, the numbers start going up. Once you start getting to 175 yard holes, now the PGA Tour average is above that. So it's 3.07, which means now these players are playing these holes in over par. And for the amateurs, we're starting to play these holes in significantly more than over par. So a 6 handicap is averaging 3.81 strokes a hole, which means about 80% of the time they make bogey on this 175 yard to 200 yard par 3. And as you get out to the longer holes, what you find is that at a 225 to 250 yard par 3, the average one handicap is playing this hole in almost 4 shots. So basically a bogey hole for an almost scratch handicap. So that point I made at the beginning about how we basically all suck at par 3s, well, here's the data. I wasn't kidding. The other thing about par 3s is they tend to have a disproportionately large impact on our scores overall. And here's an example to show you how that works. So let's assume you're an 8 handicap player who's playing TPC Harding Park in San Francisco, where they played the 2020 PGA Championship. Here's a scorecard. Let's say we play the Blues. Now there's 4 par 3s at Harding Park, which accounts for 4 out of 18, so that's 22% of the holes are par 3s. We'll keep that in mind for the future. We see that they're at 165 yards, 200 yards, 185 yards, and 175 yards. So if you just take the average scores for an 8 handicap at those yardages and you add them up, what you end up with is 15.26 shots over those 4 holes. Now par is 12 because they're par 3, so 3 times 4 is 12. So that's 3.26 shots over par. Now let's suppose you're trying to shoot your handicap. You just spent 3.26 of those 8 shots on the par 3s. So you spent 40% of your shots on 22% of the holes. That means now you got to make up the other 20% somewhere else to be able to hit your handicap. And so the par 3s really kind of punch above their weight when it comes to impacting our scores, which is why Brooks at the beginning talks about just wanting to play them at even par. The great news about this is if you play these holes in pretty close to even par, you're actually gaining strokes on the field or gaining strokes on your handicap. I'll repeat that because it's super important. For par 3s, just making par is positive strokes gained. Now you're probably asking, but why? Why are these short holes so friggin' hard? Well, architects gotta architect, right? Otherwise, we'd probably get pretty bored just hitting golf balls back and forth across the field, right? Just hanging out with the sheep and then hitting golf balls back and that was a terrible joke. Let's move on. So what architects do is they use a bunch of different things to make these holes interesting. Things like distance. Fun fact, the longest par 3 on the PGA Tour is a 288-yard monster at Oakmont, where PGA Tour players hit driver on this par 3. Architects also like to use elevation, so when the hole's below the tee box, now you have to make adjustments for how short it's going to play, and when the hole's above the tee box, now you got to make adjustments for how long it's going to play, and also you have to imagine a landing spot because it's usually a blind spot. Next is hazard, so things like water. Everybody knows the 17th hole at TPC Sawgrass, which is just all water, very little green, or bunkers, which basically every par 3 ever is just surrounded by bunkers. Sometimes these bunkers are even in the middle of the green, like a couple of PGA Tour courses, which is kind of strange, but hey, it makes it interesting. And then there's green size and contours, like number 12 at Augusta, right? It's a fairly narrow green, hard to land the ball on, and there's parts of the green where if you land the ball there, it's just not going to stop. It's going to roll off, possibly into the water, doubling up on that green contour and a bit of a hazard there. And then finally, we've got everyone's least favorite and most variable wind, which architects like to use all the time. Like at my home course, all 4 of the par 3s are massively affected by wind, which makes them way harder than they look on paper and increases the frustration level every time you play there. It's part of the game. And then to make it even more interesting, architects like to stack all these different features on top of each other, which make these par 3s way more difficult to navigate. And just to rub it in, here's the biggest clincher. The key to making a good par 3 is to make it look accessible from the tee. And then when you get up there, pow, right in the kisser. Yeah, course architects are the best people. The best people. Just kidding, I really like course architects. Thank you for making such nice courses for us. Now, while we can't change these things, knowing what to look for is half the battle. Let's talk about how to make that foolproof plan we talked about at the beginning. So step 1, if you can, make a plan beforehand. Making a plan when you're not standing on the tee with all that adrenaline and without knowing where the flag is, often a sucker pin, that's extremely valuable. The pros do this all the time. Tiger does this all the time. If you're disciplined like Tiger, you will play like Tiger. So here are the things to consider when making your plan. First, what features did the architect use to make this hole hard? Interesting. These are the things we just talked about, like wind, distance, elevation. Even just thinking about these kind of help you get a feel for the hole and maybe understand the way that the architect intended for that hole to be played. Next, decide on where it's okay to miss for the easiest up and down. Now remember, we talked about how making par on a par 3 means you have positive strokes gained, and so we're not trying to go birdie seeking here. And that means if you need to chip and putt for par, that's totally cool. So here's an example. Number 8 at Harding Park has a big grass bunker on the left and a big sand bunker on the right. And the way the green contours are set up, you kind of don't want to be long left or long right. So the 2 best places to miss are either short center right or long straight. And so when I'm playing there, that's where I'm going to optimize for, because I know there's the easiest places that I can do a little chip shot to get up and in if I miss the green. And C, make clear rules for yourself of where not to go. So here's a great example from Colin Morikawa's yardage book from the Masters. This is hole number 12, and it's pretty clear where he does not want to go. This is a good example also. We talked about green contours in section 2. This is it right here. You land there and you're in trouble. But anyway, the key point is he decided beforehand of where not to go at all. And so when he's on the tee and the fear and greed are starting to kick in, he's got a clear plan of like, no, we're not going over there. So number 2, choose the most reliable shot. This means don't get fancy. This is not the time to pull out that 2-iron stinger you saw in that one video that one time and you're like, man, I can do this. This is the time. No, it's not. This is not the time. This is the time to pull out the most reliable club where you can hit the most reliable shot to this hole. And that leads us to B, which is club up if you need to, right? You're way better off hitting an 80% 7-iron than you are trying to lean on an 100% 8-iron to hit perfectly, because the margins for error on a par 3 are significantly smaller, and so they're more penalizing when you miss. And that leads us to C. Really, the focus for most of us on a par 3 should be to just hit the green, make 2 putts, make par, be happy. Right, a great example of this is Jon Rahm at the 2023 Masters just this past weekend, where on number 12, final round, right, he's got a bit of a lead going into it, but not that much. Aims for the center of the green, 40 feet from the hole, but that was his plan. Made 40 feet from the hole, 2-putt par, nice and easy. He was happy. Say it with me. Par on a par 3 is strokes gained. And finally, the most important tip of all, watch everyone else's shots and get feedback from them. Like imagine if you were about to hit a putt and somebody had one just behind you on the exact same line. You'd be watching that putt like a hawk. You're about to hit a shot from the same spot with all the same conditions to the screen. So you should be watching that like a hawk. Now you're going to say, Manu, I always watch my buddy's shots. Duh, that's just being a good playing partner. Absolutely. The difference on par 3s is you're not just watching them to see where they go so you can help them look for the ball. You're watching them to see how they're affected by the wind, how they're affected by the green contours, how they're affected by the elevation. And hopefully your buddy hits a good shot so you can actually see what happens. You don't really get a lot of feedback from a shank, but we'll worry about that later. Step 1, play with better people. I'm just kidding. And C, ideally, and especially if it's your first time playing a course, don't go first. Unless it's your honor, of course, and then you should go first. But otherwise, let other folks hit first and watch to gather more data from their shots. Especially because wind can be so variable, from hour to hour, day to day. So the more data we have, the better decisions we can make beforehand. Speaking of wind, check out this video to come up with good wind strategy for these par 3s and the other holes too. And that is it. You are now par 3 certified. So go out there and kick some par 3 butt. Thanks for watching. Keep hanging out, being cool, and see you next time. Ciao. In this video, we're going to talk about, in this video, my best papa